The digestive and respiratory systems share a pathway here. So we have to have some traffic control to control where air goes and where the bolus goes. First, let's look at what happens when you're breathing. So this first picture here shows breathing. Now notice there is a bolus, but the bolus is still in the mouth. So you can chew and breathe at the same time. When you're breathing, the airway is open. So air can come in the nose, it can come down through the pharynx, and then it will go through here into the larynx. And from the larynx, it'll go down into the lungs. So we have the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and then that would go to the trachea, the bronchi, down to the lungs. Notice that during this time, the uvula is down, and the epiglottis is up. Also, when you're breathing, the esophageal sphincters are closed. So you have an upper esophageal sphincter, it is closed while breathing in order to keep air out of your stomach. And you have a lower esophageal sphincter. Because of its proximity to the heart, it is also sometimes called the cardiac sphincter. It doesn't actually have anything to do with the heart. It's just near the heart. This sphincter is also closed while you're breathing. Now we can look at the picture that shows swallowing. So here's the bolus. When you swallow, you need to close off the airways. You definitely don't want that bolus going in the airway. That would make you choke and you could die. So the uvula goes up, and the purpose of this is to keep the bolus out of the nose. Maybe sometimes you've laughed while you were swallowing and then your drink comes out of your nose. That's because when you laugh, the uvula moves around and it can't keep the bolus out of your nose like it should. Also, the epiglottis goes down. So that it covers the larynx. This forces the food to go to the tube back here, which is the esophagus. So then the bolus would be here. It goes down the tube, so this whole tube right here is the esophagus. And it is a muscular tube that actually squeezes, it does peristalsis to push the bolus down. When you swallow, the two esophageal sphincters open. So the upper one will open to let the bolus into the esophagus. And the lower one will open to let the bolus into the stomach. And another important function of this lower one is that it keeps the gastric juice out of the esophagus. So all the rest of the time, except when you're swallowing, it is closed to keep the gastric juice out of the esophagus. This is important because gastric juice is acidic and it burns the esophagus. And this is what's commonly known as heartburn. So heartburn doesn't actually have anything to do with your heart. It's stomach acid getting up into the esophagus and burning the esophagus. It's just called heartburn because you experience that pain in your chest, and your heart is in your chest.
Swallowing occurs in two stages, the oropharyngeal and esophageal stages. At the start of a swallow, a food bolus is voluntarily pressed by the tongue up against the roof of the mouth and backwards towards the pharynx. In response to activation of pharyngeal pressure receptors, the swallowing center in the medulla initiates reflexes that prevent food entry into respiratory passageways. The uvula contracts, which blocks the nasal passages from the pharynx. The laryngeal muscles contract, closing the glottis at the top of the trachea by tightly aligning the vocal folds. The epiglottis swings down upon the closed glottis. With all airways blocked off, respiration is temporarily inhibited. As the upper esophageal sphincter relaxes, pharyngeal contractions drive the bolus into the esophagus. The oropharyngeal stage is done and breathing resumes. During the esophageal stage, a primary wave of peristalsis initiated by the swallowing center pushes the bolus through the esophagus. As the bolus travels through the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes, allowing the food to enter the stomach. If the bolus is sticky and adheres to the esophagus, secondary peristaltic waves triggered by the intrinsic plexus at the point of distension completely clear the esophageal lumen to finish the swallow.